Greetings, comrades in arms. Today we'll explore one of the most intriguing hypothetical scenarios in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. What would happen if all four Chaos gods suddenly vanished? Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, the galaxy's greatest threats, would simply cease to exist. How would the Imperium change? What would become of the traitor legions? What future awaited the other races? If you're interested in this topic, get comfortable. We're in for a deep dive. And don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There's plenty of exciting Warhammer 40,000 content to come. So, let's begin. In the 42nd millennium during the Indomitus Age, as the Great Rift tore the galaxy in two and demonic legions swept across the Imperium's worlds, the impossible occurred. The four dark gods of chaos ceased to exist. Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh vanished from the warp, leaving the galaxy in a state of shock and uncertainty. Before analyzing the consequences, it is worth considering several theoretical scenarios that could lead to such a cataclysm. Scenario 1. The Emperor's Awakening. The most obvious option is the full awakening of the Emperor of humanity on the Golden Throne. His psychic power, accumulated over 10,000 years, could reach such a level that he could destroy or seal the ruinous powers with a single act of will. However, this would require power beyond anything he had previously demonstrated. Scenario 2. The Eldar Prophecy. The ancient Eldar foretold the birth of Enid, a god of the dead who would oppose Slaanesh. Perhaps the combined efforts of Eldar craftsmen and Drukhari, coupled with Enid's power, created a chain reaction that destroyed all four Chaos gods. Scenario 3. The Tzeentch Paradox. The most absurd yet paradoxically logical scenario. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, wove such a complex plot that he inadvertently created the conditions for his own destruction. The plan was so complex that it included the destruction of all four gods as a necessary step toward an even greater goal. But when the plan was realized, it turned out there was no next step. Scenario 4. Malal's Rise. The forgotten fifth god of chaos, Malal, or Malice, the embodiment of chaos's anarchy and self-destruction, could have amassed enough power to destroy his brethren. As the embodiment of the self-loathing paradox of chaos, Malal could become a weapon against the other dark gods. Scenario 5. Technological Solution. The Necrons, with their god-level technology, could activate an ancient Catan device capable of disabling the warp, or isolating it from the Imperium so effectively that the Chaos gods, deprived of the nourishment of mortal emotions, simply dissolve. Scenario 6. Ork Field Wog. And this is the most absurd option. Orks have a unique psychic ability. Their collective belief literally bends reality. If enough orcs believe something strongly enough, it becomes true. Red cars go faster because orcs believe it. Orc weapons work even when they shouldn't because orcs are convinced they work. Imagine this. In the midst of the greatest war in galactic history, with trillions of orcs united under some incredibly powerful war boss, perhaps Gazgul himself, or even an incarnation of Gork and Mork, the unthinkable happened. In the heat of battle against the demonic hordes, one of the orc philosophers, if such a word can even be applied to orcs, had a brilliant idea. What if there were no Chaos Gith at all? That would be fun. And the idea spread. From orc to orc, from clan to clan, from world to world. Imagine if they weren't there. They're almost gone. I heard chaos is over. Yes, it's already over, I tell you so. Orcish logic is simple. If something is fun, it must be true. And what could be more fun than making four gods disappear simply because the orcs decided so? The Wa psychic field, amplified by billions and trillions of orcs, all of whom sincerely believed that chaos was gone, or should be gone, or was already nearly gone, orc logic doesn't require precision, created a warp anomaly of unimaginable proportions. The orc collective reality, where chaos is no longer because we said so, collided with the reality of the warp, where chaos very much existed, and the orcs won. Not through war, not through ritual, not through technology, through the pure, stubborn, absurd belief that chaos no longer exists. The four dark gods, who had existed for tens of thousands of years, feeding on the emotions of every sentient being in the galaxy, simply ceased to exist because enough orcs decided it would be fun that way. The most terrifying thing about this scenario is that it fits perfectly with established orc lore. Their psychic abilities really do work that way. They really can bend reality through collective belief. And if enough orcs, in a short enough time, believed in the disappearance of chaos, the Warhammer 40,000 universe is absurd enough for it to work. The greatest irony would be that no race in the galaxy would ever know the true cause. The Inquisition would attribute it to the Emperor's divine intervention. The Eldar would think their ancient prophecies had come true. The Necrons would see it as a result of their technology. And the Orcs would simply continue fighting, content to get rid of those boring chaos gith so there would be more room for a real fight. And somewhere in the warp, Gorka Morka, or Gork and Mork, would be laughing at the greatest joke in the history of the galaxy, that the most primitive race had accidentally accomplished what the Emperor, the Eldar gods, and all the ancient civilizations combined had failed to achieve. Whatever the cause, the consequences of this event would have changed the galaxy beyond recognition. The first and most dramatic change would affect the nature of the warp itself. The Imperium, a raging ocean of chaotic energies for millennia, suddenly calmed. Not to the point of complete calm, the warp is inherently turbulent, reflecting the emotions of all psychically active beings in the galaxy. But the storms ceased. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, that divided the galaxy began to heal. The process wouldn't be instantaneous. Such a massive rupture in reality would take decades, perhaps centuries to heal. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope for restoring communication between the Imperium Sanctus and the Imperium Nihilus. The Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon, suddenly shone brighter than ever. Without the constant obstruction of the dark gods, the Emperor's light reached even the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Warp navigation became incomparably easier and safer. Journeys that had taken months could now be completed in weeks or even days. However, it would be naive to think the warp had become completely safe. Predatory entities not belonging to the Chaos Legion still inhabited the Imperium. Ensalvers, Cycneines, and other warp predators posed a danger to the unwary. Furthermore, residual phenomena lingered in the warp, echoes of the ruinous powers, much like a star that continues to glow long after it has died. Trillions of demons, from the tiniest Nurglings to the mightiest great unclean ones, from the bloodthirsty hounds of Khorne to the cunning lords of change of Tzeentch, suddenly found themselves cut off from their source of existence. Chaos Demons are not independent beings, but fragments of the consciousness and power of their patron gods. Without their gods, they were doomed. The process of extinction would be painful and drawn out. The demons did not vanish instantly. Instead, they began to weaken, lose form, and dissipate. Those who remained in the material world during the cataclysm lingered longer, feeding on the residual emotions of mortals, but their time was limited. Greater demons such as Kabanda, Kairos Faithweaver, Rotigus, and Nakari possessed sufficient power to endure longer than others, perhaps years or even decades, but they too were doomed to fade. The demon worlds of the warp, Khorne's brass throne, Nurgle's garden, Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth, and Slaanesh's dark city, began to disintegrate. These realms were not just places, but the materialized will of the gods. Without their creators, they crumbled, dissolving into amorphous warp energy. An interesting question would arise with demonic weapons and artifacts. Demonic blades containing bound demons would begin to fade. Their wielders would find their once powerful weapons losing their power with each passing day. Some Chaos Warriors would perceive this as betrayal, others as liberation. Now let's consider how the disappearance of chaos would affect the major factions of the galaxy. For the Imperium, the disappearance of chaos would be an event of apocalyptic proportions, but in a positive sense. For the first time in 10,000 years, the existential threat that defined the very existence of human civilization was eliminated. The reaction of the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy would have been complex and contradictory. For the Ordo Malleus, dedicated to combating the demonic threat, the disappearance of chaos would have meant an existential crisis. Thousands of Inquisitors would suddenly find their life's mission complete. Some would have seen this as the Emperor's greatest victory, while others would have viewed such a sudden deliverance with suspicion and begun to look for a catch. The Ecclesiarchy would proclaim this event a divine miracle, the ultimate proof of the Emperor's divinity. New holy days would be celebrated, monuments erected, new orders founded to commemorate this moment. However, in private, the cardinals would wonder, if the greatest enemy has been defeated, what is the Imperium's purpose now? For the Space Marines, the disappearance of chaos would have profound consequences. Many chapters, especially those descended from the legions that fought in the Horus heresy, defined themselves by opposing chaos. The Dark Angels, who had hunted the fallen for 10,000 years, would suddenly find their greatest enemies either dead or no longer a threat. The Space Wolves, the Grey Knights, the Exorcists, all these chapters would have to rethink their role. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch and Lord Commander of the Imperium, would have approached this event with his characteristic pragmatism. After initial distrust and careful consideration, he would have begun to reorient the Imperium's forces. The threat of chaos had vanished, but the Xenos, Tyranids, Orks, Necrons remained. Moreover, the Imperium would now have the resources for the long-awaited reforms Guilliman had planned, but had been unable to implement due to constant warfare. For the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's guardians, the disappearance of chaos would mean an opportunity to focus on their true goal, the Emperor's protection. Captain General Troyak would gather the Imperium's greatest tech priests and biomasters to attempt the previously unthinkable, repairing or even disabling the Golden Throne. Without the constant pressure of chaos on the warp, the Emperor might not need such intense psychic protection. It was theorized that he could be healed, or even allowed to die and be reborn. It would be a risky move, but for the first time in millennia, it was possible. For the warriors of chaos, the disappearance of their gods would be an absolute catastrophe. For 10,000 years they fought in the name of the dark gods, made sacrifices, received gifts and mutations, betrayed all humanity and themselves to serve the ruinous powers. And now the gods were gone, leaving them with nothing. The reaction of the different legions would have varied considerably. The World Eaters, Khorne's legion, would have suffered the most. The butcher's nails implanted in their skulls would continue to cause agony. But now, without the promise of redemption through blood, many berserkers would simply go mad with pain and rage, unable to find an outlet. Without Khorne's blessings, their bodies would begin to fail. The mutations fostered by the blood god's will would be rejected. It is likely that a significant portion of the legion would perish within the first few months. The Thousand Sons, a legion of Tzeentch's sorcerers, would face a unique challenge. Their rubric, the very thing that had rendered the majority of the legion into hollow armor, animated by warp energy, would begin to crumble. Aspiring sorcerers would find their psychic powers weakening, their control over their rubrics fading. Ahriman, the legion's greatest sorcerer, might find a way to maintain his power, but even for him, it would be a challenge. The legion would face an existential crisis: what to do with beings whose essence is so intimately tied to a vanished god. The Death Guard, Nurgle's legion, would experience a strange liberation. The gifts of Grandfather Nurgle, the undying rot, the diseases that had turned them into walking corpses, would begin to recede. For some, this would be a blessing. For the first time in millennia, they would feel alive. For others, who had fully embraced the rot, it would be a curse. Morgarion might even consider reconciliation with the Imperium, though the likelihood of forgiveness was close to zero. The Emperor's children, the Legion of Slaanesh, would have faced emptiness. Their entire existence had been dedicated to the pursuit of perfection and new sensations. Without Slaanesh, they would have found themselves unable to feel anything, their nervous systems so overloaded by millennia of excess that normal sensations would have seemed insignificant. Many would have fallen into catatonia or committed suicide. Others would have begun frantically seeking new means of stimulation, becoming even more dangerous. Abaddon the Despoiler, the warlord of chaos who had led 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium, would find himself in a situation that could only be described as tragicomic. His greatest goal, the destruction of the Imperium, was within his reach, but the means to achieve it had vanished. However, Abaddon was more than just a chaos fanatic. He was, first and foremost, a warrior and strategist who used chaos as a tool rather than blindly worshipping it. Without the chaos gods, he might have attempted to unite the disparate traitor forces under his banner, not through religious fanaticism, but through sheer willpower and the promise of power. It would have been a daunting task, but if anyone could accomplish it, it was Abaddon. The word-bearers, the most religious of all the Chaos Legions, would have been broken. Their faith was their strength, and with the gods gone, many would have gone mad or committed suicide. Erebus and Khor Pharon, the first of the traitors, might have desperately sought to find new gods to worship or resurrect the old ones. The Iron Warriors, by contrast, would have reacted with cynical relief. Perturabo and his legion had never loved the Chaos gods, using their power merely as a tool. Freed from demonic influence, they could become a pure mercenary force, dangerous, effective, and utterly pragmatic. For the Eldar, the disappearance of chaos would mean the rebirth of hope, absent for millennia. But most of all, it would mean the disappearance of Slaanesh, she who thirsts, the ultimate nightmare of their race. With Slaanesh gone, the craft worlds no longer needed the protection of the infinite circuits. For the first time since the fall, the Eldar's souls were not doomed to be consumed by the god of pleasure upon death. This would have been a shocking revelation. The fear that had defined their culture for 10,000 years had suddenly vanished. The seers and autarchs would begin planning the impossible, the restoration of their civilization. With the warp more secure, the Eldar could consider colonizing new worlds, not limited to craft worlds. The avatars of Cain, always ready for battle, could be used not only for defense but also for expansion. However, not everything would be so rosy. Many Eldar had lived for thousands of years in fear of Slaanesh. A sudden release from this fear could trigger a psychological crisis. What was the purpose of their ascetic existence if the threat was no longer present? Some might even return to the old ways that led to the fall, failing to understand the lesson. The Dark Eldar of Khorne would face a paradox. Their civilization was built on the need to feed on the suffering of others to prevent Slaanesh from draining their own souls. Without Slaanesh, this need would disappear. But would the addiction disappear? Millennia of torture and suffering had shaped the Drukhari into creatures who didn't just need the pain of others to survive, they craved it. Some Archons might have attempted to reform Khorne society, but most would have continued their raids simply because that was all they knew. Vect, supreme overlord of Khorne, would have regarded this with characteristic paranoia. For a being who had lived millennia in intrigue, this sudden rescue would have seemed suspicious. He would have begun to weave new plots, searching for hidden threats and opportunities. The Harlequins, servants of the laughter god Kyogar, would discover that their patron was the only Eldar god to survive both the fall and the disappearance of chaos. Their role as guardians of the Black Library and protectors from chaos would be altered, but not eliminated. They could become a unifying force for all Eldar factions. Iniad, the Eldar god of the dead, whose birth was hastened by the events of the War of the Fracture, could now fully awaken without Slaanesh's interference. This would open the door to a true resurrection of Eldar civilization, not a return to the past, but the creation of something new. The Exodite maiden worlds, living in harmony with nature, were least affected by the disappearance of chaos. For them, it was merely a confirmation of the correctness of their path. However, they could have become more open to contact with their cosmic brethren. The Orks would have reacted to the disappearance of chaos simply. They would have fewer enemies to attack, and this upset them. Demons were excellent opponents, always ready for a fight, virtually indestructible, and very dangerous. Their disappearance left a void in the Orks' entertainment. However, the nature of Orks is such that they quickly find new targets. Without constant warp storms, navigation became easier, meaning Orks could reach new worlds faster. This could have led to an increase in the scale and frequency of Ork crusades. Gorka Morka, the dual Ork war god, or two gods, Gork and Mork depending on which Ork you ask, was virtually unaffected by the disappearance of chaos. The Ork gods existed in the warp, but were separated from chaos, feeding on the faith and fighting spirit of the Orks themselves. Moreover, without competition from the ruinous powers, Gorka Morka's influence in the warp may have even grown stronger. Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, the greatest Ork warlord of modern times, could use a more stable warp to orchestrate the greatest Wa in history, uniting Orks from across the galaxy against, well, everyone else. The Tau Empire, a young and expansionist civilization, would have viewed the disappearance of chaos with their characteristic pragmatism and incomprehension. The Tau have always had a poor understanding of the nature of the warp and chaos due to their weak psychic activity. For them, it would simply have been an improvement in the conditions for interstellar travel. The water, diplomats, and fire, warrior castes, would see this as an opportunity for accelerated expansion. Worlds previously inaccessible due to warp storms were now accessible. The ethereals would proclaim this a sign that the greater good was triumphant, and the universe was naturally moving toward order and unity. However, some Tau, particularly those who had contact with humans and other warp-aware races, would have begun to question the true nature of what had happened. Commander Shadowsun might have begun a more serious investigation of psychic phenomena, recognizing that ignorance in this area leaves the Tau vulnerable. The Farsight enclaves, which had seceded from the Tau Empire, could benefit even more from access to forbidden technology and knowledge. Commander Farsight, wielding the Dawnblade, an artifact that extends his life by absorbing souls, might have discovered changes in the weapon's performance. For the Necrons, an ancient machine race awakened after millions of years of slumber, the disappearance of chaos would be convenient. The Necrons have always despised the warp and everything connected to it as a lower, chaotic form of existence compared to the purity of matter and physical laws. The Silent King, leader of the Necrons, could have seen this as an opportunity to carry out his greatest plan, closing the warp and severing it from the material world forever. With the warp weakened, this task would be significantly easier. Necron technology, particularly related to pylons, warp-suppressing devices, would become incredibly valuable to all factions. This could lead to temporary alliances or, conversely, conflicts over control of Necron tomb worlds. The various Necron dynasties would have reacted differently. The Sotek dynasty, obsessed with cataloging and collecting, would have begun collecting samples of the fading demons for study. The Novak dynasty would have continued its genocide of organic life. The Nefrite dynasty would have attempted to exploit the situation to strengthen its position with the Silent King. Trasin, the deceiver of gods, the only one of the Catan, the Necron star gods, to retain significant fragments of his consciousness, might attempt to exploit the power vacuum in the warp to increase his own influence. For the Tyranids, extragalactic world devourers, the disappearance of chaos would mean the removal of one of the few obstacles in their path. The Tyranids generated a warp shadow, a psychic pressure that suppressed the warp in the areas where their hive fleets were concentrated. Chaos was one of the few forces capable of countering this. Without the demonic incursions that destabilized worlds before the Tyranids' arrival, the hive fleets would have been more effective. However, the chaotic destruction they benefited from, weakening worlds' defenses, would also have been eliminated. The hive mind, the collective consciousness of the Tyranids, would likely perceive the disappearance of chaos as a change in environmental conditions, nothing more. Tyranids adapt to any conditions. They might even evolve new forms of organisms specialized in hunting the remaining warp entities. An interesting question. Would the disappearance of chaos have affected the reason the Tyranids came to the galaxy in the first place? Some theories suggested they were drawn by the psychic light of the Astronomicon or the cataclysms of chaos. If so, then after the warp stabilized, the flow of new hive fleets might have diminished. Now let's look at the long-term consequences and how the galaxy would change in the decades and centuries after chaos disappeared. In the decades and centuries following the disappearance of chaos, the galaxy would have changed beyond recognition. The political map, fixed by millennia of constant war, would have begun to transform. Robute Guilliman would finally have the opportunity to implement the reforms he dreamed of. The Adeptus Terra, that gargantuan bureaucratic behemoth that had devoured resources and stifled innovation, could be restructured. Not without resistance, the High Lords of Terra were reluctant to relinquish power, but with less need to concentrate all resources on defending against chaos, reforms would be possible. The Inquisition would lose some of its absolute power. Without the constant threat of demonic invasion, its methods of total control and radical measures would seem less justified. Movements would emerge to limit the powers of the Inquisitors, to promote transparency and accountability. The ecclesiarchy would face a theological crisis. If the emperor had defeated chaos, did that mean he no longer needed psyker sacrifices? Could some of the imperial cult's most rigid doctrines be reconsidered? Reformist movements would emerge, preaching a gentler, more compassionate faith, in opposition to the traditionalists. With the closure of the Great Rift, the connection between the Imperium Sanctus and the Imperium Nihilus could be restored. This would be a difficult process. The Imperium Nihilus developed separately, developing its own leaders and traditions. Reunification would require subtle diplomacy and a willingness to compromise on both sides. This could potentially lead to a federalization of the Imperium. Instead of one monolithic state ruled from Terra, several regional centers with greater autonomy would emerge. Guilliman, having studied the history of Ultramar, might have seen this not as a weakening, but as a strengthening of the Imperium through decentralization. One of the most significant long-term consequences would be a slowing or even halting of the Imperium's technological degradation. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, the disappearance of chaos would mean a safer opportunity to explore the dark age of technology. Many artifacts and knowledge from that period had been sealed or destroyed due to chaos's corruption. Now they could be studied with less risk. Moreover, without the constant threat of scrap terminal corruption, the demonic possession of machines, tech priests could more boldly experiment with AI and advanced technology. This would be controversial. Fear of the abominable intelligence was deeply ingrained in Mechanicus doctrine, but some radical mages would begin to reconsider these prohibitions. Expeditions to long-lost forge worlds located within warp storm zones could recover lost STCs, standard construction templates. Each new STC would represent a revolution in a specific area of technology. With the threat of Nurgle infestation gone, biological research could accelerate, curing diseases, improving human physiology, and perhaps even creating new modifications for space marines. All of this would become more achievable. Gene seed fabricators could attempt to restore the lost organs of some legions, or even create new ones. Call's Primarch project, the creation of the Primaris Space Marines, could be expanded and improved. One of the most controversial and unpredictable aspects is how the disappearance of chaos would affect the psychic evolution of humanity. The Emperor always assumed that humanity would evolve into a psychic species. The birth of psychers increased with each generation. But this process was dangerous precisely because of chaos. Every psyker was a potential gateway for demons. Without chaos, this danger would be dramatically reduced. Psychers would no longer need to be gathered on black ships as sacrifices to the Emperor, or at least not in such numbers. They could be trained and integrated into society. This could lead to a psychic renaissance, the emergence of institutes for the training of psychers, psychic academies, and new applications of psychic powers for peaceful purposes. Perhaps within a few generations, a significant portion of humanity would possess psychic abilities. However, this would not be without dangers. The warp had not become completely safe, merely less hostile. Untrained psychers still posed a risk. A new system of training and control would be needed, less brutal than the previous one, but still necessary. The disappearance of chaos did not mean the arrival of peace. On the contrary, it could unleash new conflicts. With the external threat waning, internal conflicts, suppressed by the need for unity, could escalate. Planetary governors with significant military forces could begin a struggle for independence or attempt to seize neighboring systems. The various factions within the Imperium, reformers versus traditionalists, centralists versus federalists, technocrats versus theocrats, would all engage in political and possibly military struggle over the future of the Imperium. Without the constant demonic incursions that weakened everyone, the Xenos races would have become more aggressive. The Tau would have been able to significantly expand their empire. The Orks would have staged more massive wogs. The Necrons would have accelerated their awakening. This could potentially lead to a cold war between several galactic powers, the Imperium, the Tau, the resurgent Eldar, and the Necrons. Each side would be too powerful to be easily defeated, but ambitious enough to not settle for the status quo. The irony would be that the Tyranids, extragalactic invaders, could become the unifying threat that chaos once was. The galaxy's various races might realize that, faced with the absolute threat of total annihilation, old rivalries become secondary. Perhaps for the first time in history, temporary alliances could be formed between the Imperium, the Eldar, the Tau, and even some Necron dynasties against a common enemy. This wouldn't mean peace, but it could lead to periods of cooperation. For 10,000 years, the Imperium's culture was steeped in darkness, militarism, and religious fanaticism. The disappearance of chaos could lead to a cultural renaissance. On worlds no longer under constant threat of demonic incursion, art could flourish. Not the propaganda art of the ecclesiarchy, but genuine creative expression. Literature, music, and the visual arts, long suppressed by censorship and a lack of resources, would be given new life. It would be a gradual process. Cultural change occurs more slowly than political change, but within a few generations, the Imperium's society could become significantly more open and diverse. One of the most brutal aspects of the Imperium was its treatment of mutants and abhumans, genetically modified or evolved humans. They were discriminated against, persecuted, and often exterminated, as mutation was associated with chaos. Without chaos, this justification would disappear. Mutant and abhuman rights movements could gain strength. Ogrins, Ratlings, Squats, Wotans, and other abhuman races could demand equal rights. It would be a long struggle against ingrained prejudices, but for the first time, it would be possible. The Space Marines, for centuries the embodiment of the war against chaos, would need to rethink their role. Some chapters could become more like knightly orders, protectors of the weak, promoters of order, and not simply killing machines. The Imperial Guard, which has always fought in conditions of total war, could be given the opportunity to professionalize. Better training, better equipment, more humane treatment of soldiers. All this would be possible without constantly throwing billions of lives into the meat grinder of war. The ecclesiarchy would face the greatest theological challenge in its history. Traditional doctrine held that humanity existed under constant siege, that only through sacrifice and faith could it survive, and that the emperor demanded unquestioning obedience and self-sacrifice. But if the greatest enemy has been defeated, if the situation is not as hopeless as claimed, does this not mean that some doctrines need to be revised? Reformist movements would arise within the cult. They would preach that victory over chaos is a sign that humanity is ready for the next stage of its development, that the emperor desires not just the survival, but the prosperity of humanity, that faith should inspire, not suppress. Traditionalists, particularly within the Adeptus Ministorum and some ultra-conservative sororitas orders, would have resisted these ideas. For them, existing doctrine was sacred and immutable. This could have led to a schism within the imperial cult. On some worlds, especially remote ones, ancient pre-imperial religions suppressed by the ecclesiarchy could be revived. In a more lenient religious climate, they would be able to practice them openly. This would create a religious diversity unthinkable in the traditional Imperium, where any deviation from the imperial cult was considered heresy. But if the emperor has conquered chaos, perhaps he is powerful enough to not need an absolute monopoly on faith. The greatest question that all humanity would ask is, what now of the emperor? If the disappearance of chaos was the emperor's doing, perhaps he had expended so much power that he could finally awaken. 10,000 years of imprisonment on the Golden Throne would be over. But what would he be like? A being who spent 10 millennia in agony, constantly battling the forces of chaos, would hardly have remained unchanged. Perhaps the emperor would have become more cruel, more alienated from humanity. Or, conversely, understanding suffering might have made him more compassionate. The awakened emperor could personally lead the restoration of the Imperium, but this would create new problems. Millennia of power had formed institutions unwilling to obey even him. How could the divine authority of the emperor be balanced with the reality of a complex, multi-layered imperial bureaucracy? Alternatively, the custodes and tech priests could attempt to heal the emperor without awakening him. New biotechnologies, access to Dark Age knowledge, even the aid of the Eldar homunculi, in exchange for something incredibly valuable. All of this could be put to use. The process would take decades or centuries, but the result could be the emperor's physical resurrection, not just the awakening of his dying body on the throne, but the complete restoration of his physical form. The most radical possibility is that the emperor could abandon material existence entirely, becoming a pure warp entity, a warp god of humanity. 10,000 years of faith from trillions of people could transform him from a mere powerful psyker into a true deity. It would be ironic. The emperor, who had spent his entire life rejecting religion and divinity, would become the very thing he fought against. But it could also be a necessary evolutionary step. As a warp god, the emperor could protect humanity on a level unattainable by any material being. Perhaps, despite the disappearance of chaos, the emperor was unable or unwilling to leave the throne. The Astronomicon still demanded his attention. The warp, though calmed, still required stabilization. The emperor might decide that his duty was not yet complete. In this case, the Imperium would continue to exist in its current form, but with the hope of a future awakening. Robute Guilliman would continue to rule in the emperor's name, perhaps receiving clearer direction now that the emperor was no longer devoting all his power to the fight against chaos. The disappearance of chaos in the Warhammer 40,000 universe would be transformative, but not necessarily salvific. This is a world where, in the grim darkness of the distant future, there is only war, and simply eliminating one threat would not transform it into a utopia. At best, the galaxy could have entered an era of slow, gradual recovery. The Imperium, freed from the need to expend the vast majority of its resources on defending itself from chaos, could have begun social and technological reforms. The technological stagnation that characterized the 42nd millennium would have given way to cautious progress. The galaxy's various races, no longer united in a common struggle against chaos, but also freed from the constant demonic incursions that destabilize everyone, could achieve some semblance of a galactic balance of power. Not peace, but a regulated rivalry, where diplomacy would play a greater role than all-out war. Humanity's psychic evolution would have continued, but more safely. Within a few thousand years, humanity could have become a fully psychic species, as the Emperor had foreseen, realizing his original vision. Culturally, the galaxy would become more diverse, vibrant, and less gloomy. Art, science, philosophy, everything suppressed by centuries of total war, could be reborn. In the worst-case scenario, the disappearance of chaos would lead to renewed chaos, but this time political and social. The Imperium, deprived of a unifying enemy, would disintegrate into warring factions. Civil wars comparable to the Horus Heresy could devastate the galaxy. Xenos empires, no longer restrained by demonic incursions, would have begun aggressive expansion, clashing with each other and with an Imperium weakened by civil wars. The Tyranids would have been especially dangerous. Without chaos to distract their defenders, they could have devoured the galaxy within centuries. A Chaos Space Marine, desperate and embittered, might wage a war of vengeance against the Imperium, not for the sake of the gods, but out of pure hatred. Even without demonic powers, 10,000 years of experience and modification made them deadly. Humanity's psychic ascension could have gone awry. Without proper training and control, billions of new psychers could have created new dangers in the warp. Perhaps even new warp entities, not as powerful as the Chaos Gods, but dangerous enough. Most likely, the future would be mixed. Some regions would experience a golden age, peaceful, prosperous worlds where citizens would enjoy a standard of living unimaginable in previous millennia. In others, wars would continue, perhaps not against demons, but against Xenos, rebels, or simply neighboring sectors. The Imperium would transform, but slowly, over centuries and millennia. Various factions, reformers and traditionalists, centralists and federalists, would fight for the future of humanity, sometimes with words, sometimes with weapons, but gradually shaping a new society. Relations with Xenos would remain complex. Old hatreds wouldn't disappear instantly, but opportunities for dialogue, trade, and even limited cooperation would emerge. Not a unified galaxy, but a galaxy where different civilizations coexist, compete, and sometimes cooperate. In considering this hypothetical scenario, we are faced with a philosophical question about the nature of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Is the constant struggle against chaos a defining feature of this universe, or can the setting exist without this element? Chaos in 40k isn't just a collection of antagonists, it's a metaphysical threat, the embodiment of the dark side of human nature: rage, ambition, despair, excess. Chaos is a mirror, showing what happens when human emotions reach their extremes. It's a philosophical statement about the nature of evil, not external, alien, but emanating from within ourselves. Without chaos, the 40k universe would lose some of this philosophical dimension, but it would retain other defining elements: the monumental scale, the grim aesthetic, the clash of different philosophies, the theocracy of the Imperium versus the materialism of the Tau, the organic versus the mechanical among the Necrons, the individual versus the collectivism of the Tyranids. Perhaps a galaxy without chaos would still be recognizably Warhammer 40,000, but less grim, with greater potential for hope and growth. It would be grim-dark light, still dark, still brutal, but with glimmers of light. Or perhaps the nature of the universe is such that even without chaos, new horrors would rise to take its place. After all, this is a world where there are no innocents, only varying degrees of guilt. Perhaps the galaxy itself is the source of the darkness, and chaos was merely one of its manifestations. In any case, the disappearance of chaos would not mean the end of conflict, suffering, or darkness in the galaxy. It would merely mean that war, the endless war that is the heart of Warhammer 40,000, would take on new forms. And in the grim darkness of the distant future, there would still be only war. Just a different kind of war. When the gods died, we thought we were free. But in the hearts of mortals, the seeds of new gods were already being conceived. For as long as sentient beings exist, there will be emotions. And where there are emotions, there is the warp. And in the warp, There will always be something waiting, watching, hungry. We have conquered chaos, but can we conquer ourselves? A quote from Inquisitor Eisenhorn's final notes, date unknown. So we've covered all the possible consequences of Chaos's disappearance in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, from the immediate effects to the long-term changes affecting every faction. As you can see, even eliminating the greatest threat would not transform this world into a utopia. War, conflict, and suffering would remain, simply in new forms. Now it's your turn. Share in the comments. Which scenario for Chaos's disappearance do you think is most likely? Or perhaps you have your own. How do you think your favorite character or faction would react to this event? Do you think the galaxy would be better or worse without Chaos? If you found this analysis interesting, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. We have many more deep dives into Warhammer 40,000 lore, battle breakdowns, faction analyses, and much more to come. Share this video with your friends who also love 40k. Let's grow the Russian-speaking community together. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this long journey through a hypothetical galaxy without chaos. Remember, in the grim darkness of the distant future there is only war. But we can always imagine what might have been different. The Emperor watches over you, and see you in the next videos.